A black bus driver is doing his job when suddenly, police harass him for no reason. They mock him, disrespect him, and try to humiliate him in front of passengers. But what they do not know is that this man is far more powerful than they think. And by the time they realize their mistake, it is already too late. The bus moved steadily down the street, its tires rolling smoothly over the asphalt. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, and inside the bus, passengers sat quietly, lost in their thoughts. Some stared at their phones, others gazed out the window. The driver, a middle-aged black man with years of experience, kept his hands firm on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He had driven this route hundreds of times before. He knew every stop, every turn, every shortcut. This was his job, his routine, and he took pride in it. Then he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Red and blue. His stomach tightened slightly, but he kept driving. Maybe they were after someone else. But then the siren blared. He sighed and flicked on his turn signal, easing the bus to a stop near the curb. The passengers looked around, confused. A few whispered among themselves. What was going on? Outside, 2 police officers stepped out of their patrol car. They walked toward the bus with slow, deliberate steps, their hands resting near their belts. The driver had seen this before. He knew the type. Men who walked like they owned everything around them. He took a breath, pushed open the door, and waited. One officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sunglasses, stepped forward. License and registration. The driver nodded, reaching for his ID. Is there a problem, officer? The second officer, a younger man with a tight jaw, smirked. We ask the questions. The driver handed over his documents. The officer barely glanced at them before stuffing them into his pocket. You were driving suspiciously, the first cop said. The driver raised an eyebrow. Suspiciously? Yeah, the officer said, crossing his arms. You were stopping too often. The driver blinked. I drive a bus. A few passengers chuckled, but the officers did not. The second officer stepped closer. Step out of the vehicle. The driver's fingers tightened around the wheel. Why? You got a problem with following orders? No, the driver said, keeping his voice calm. I just want to know why. The first officer took off his sunglasses. Step. Now. The bus was dead silent. Passengers watched, some gripping their phones. A woman in the front row whispered, This is not right. The driver exhaled slowly. He had been through worse. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, stepping onto the pavement. The warm air hit his face, but it did nothing to ease the growing tension. The younger cop circled him like a predator. Got anything on you? He asked. No. Mind if we check? Yes. The first officer smirked. That sounds like someone hiding something. The driver's jaw clenched. Or it sounds like someone who knows his rights. A few passengers raised their phones, starting to record. The officers noticed. The younger cop scoffed. You think a camera is going to help you? It usually does. One of the passengers called out. The officers ignored the comment. The first cop stepped closer, his expression hard. Look, this can go one of 2 ways. You cooperate or we take you in. For what? The driver asked, his voice steady. For obstruction, the officer shot back. And resisting. I have not resisted anything, the driver said. The younger officer suddenly grabbed his arm. Gasps rippled through the bus. Hey, he did not do anything, a passenger shouted. Let him go, another said. The driver did not pull away. He had learned long ago that resisting only gave men like this an excuse. The officer pushed him against the side of the bus, patting him down. Nothing on him, he muttered. Check the bus, the first cop said. Excuse me? The driver asked. We are searching the vehicle, the cop said, moving toward the steps. The driver stepped in front of the door, blocking the way. You need a warrant for that. The first cop smiled coldly. You are under arrest. The driver's heartbeat pounded in his ears. For what? Obstructing an investigation, the officer replied. The driver let out a short, humorless laugh. What investigation? The officer pulled out his cuffs. Turn around. A few passengers stood up from their seats. This is illegal, one woman shouted. You cannot do this, another man called out. But the cops did not care. The metal cuffs snapped around the driver's wrists. The passengers had seen enough. A young man near the back stepped into the aisle, raising his phone higher. This is all on camera. The officers exchanged a glance, finally realizing they were being recorded from multiple angles. But it was too late. The damage was done. The bus driver stood tall, hands cuffed, his expression unreadable. He had done nothing wrong, but they had made their decision, and soon they would realize they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. The squad car's tires screeched as it pulled into the police station parking lot. The bus driver sat in the back, his hands still cuffed, his wrists sore from the rough grip of the officers. He stared out of the window, watching the officers move casually, laughing among themselves. One of them glanced at him through the rearview mirror and smirked. Bet you did not think your day was going to end like this, huh? The driver did not respond. He just breathed slowly, keeping himself calm. The door swung open, and the younger officer yanked him out of the car. Come on, big man, let us get you processed. Inside the station, the air was filled with the usual sounds. Phones ringing, officers chatting, keyboards clicking. The officers walked him past rows of desks, their colleagues barely paying attention. The desk sergeant looked up as they approached. What's the charge? The first officer shrugged. Obstruction. Resisting. The sergeant sighed, looking at the driver. You give them a hard time? The driver met his gaze. No more than usual. The sergeant smirked. Figures. He reached for the paperwork. Put him in holding. Someone will deal with him later. The officers led him toward the back, past a few other holding cells where people sat in silence, waiting. The metal door creaked open, and with a rough shove, they pushed him inside. The cuffs finally came off, leaving red marks on his wrists. He rubbed them slowly, exhaling as the door slammed shut behind him. The walls were cold, the bench harder than it looked. But he had sat in worse places, and he knew this would not last long. A call that changed everything. Far from the station, in a sleek office overlooking the city, a phone buzzed on a polished desk. A well-dressed man in his 50s glanced at the screen. He frowned as he read the message. They just arrested him. For a moment, the man said nothing. Then, with calm precision, he picked up the phone and dialed a number. The call rang once, twice. Then someone answered. This is Deputy Director Langston. They made a mistake. A pause. Who? The man's jaw tightened. The local police. They just arrested him. Silence. Then a slow exhale. I see. You need to fix it, the man continued. Immediately. Consider it handled, Langston said. The call ended. The man placed his phone down, then stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. This was about to get interesting. Back at the station, the chief of police leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee. His office was filled with old awards, faded newspaper clippings, and a picture of him shaking hands with the mayor. He had been in charge for a long time, and he ran things his way. The door opened, and one of his officers stepped in. Hey, Chief, we got a bus driver in holding. Obstruction charge. The chief chuckled, shaking his head. A bus driver? What, he refused to hand out transfers? The officer laughed. Something like that. The chief took another sip of his coffee. Nobody cares about a bus driver. Let him sit for a while. He will learn his lesson. The officer smirked and left. The chief leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head. Just another day in his station. Then the front doors of the station flew open. A group of men in dark suits strode in, their movements swift and precise. Federal agents. Every officer in the room stiffened immediately. The lead agent, a sharp-eyed man with gray at his temples, flashed his badge. "Where is your chief?" A young officer stammered. His office, sir." The agent nodded. "Not anymore." The group marched straight through the station, their presence commanding absolute authority. They reached the chief's office, and without knocking, the lead agent pushed the door open. The chief looked up, startled. "Who the hell are you?" The agent tossed a file onto the desk, his expression unreadable. "We are here for your prisoner." The chief glanced down at the folder. Classified documents, sealed orders, names he recognized but had no business dealing with. A sinking feeling hit him. "Wait, who?" he asked slowly. "The bus driver you just locked up," the agent said. "You made a mistake." The chief let out a short laugh, but there was no confidence behind it. "Come on. He is just some regular guy." A new voice cut through the room. "Not quite." The chief turned his head. A man in a tailored suit stepped inside, his face unreadable. He set down a leather briefcase on the desk and calmly opened it. Inside were legal documents, signed orders, and a thick file on the man they had arrested. The chief barely processed what he was looking at when the man spoke again. "You just arrested someone with direct connections to some of the most powerful people in this country." The words landed like a hammer. The chief's smirk vanished. "He is just a bus driver," he muttered. The man tilted his head slightly. "That bus driver has government clearance. That bus driver has been in rooms you will never step foot in. That bus driver has more influence than your entire department combined." The room was dead silent. The chief's mind raced. He had dealt with powerful people before, but this was something else entirely. The man across from him closed the briefcase. "Here is what is going to happen." The chief swallowed. "You are going to release him." Immediately, the man continued, "And you are going to hope that today is just a bad memory. Because if it is not..." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You and your entire department are finished." The chief's hands felt sweaty. He glanced at his officers, but none of them moved. The air in the station was heavy, suffocating. For the first time in years, the chief of police felt powerless in his own station. He forced himself to stand. "Bring him out," he muttered. The officers hurried to obey, fear creeping into their movements. Minutes later, the cell door swung open, and the bus driver stepped out. He looked calm, composed, like he had known this was coming all along. As he walked past the officers who had arrested him, they could not even look him in the eye. The lawyer gave him a respectful nod. "Shall we?" The bus driver exhaled slowly. "Let's go." And with that, he walked out of the station. But the officers who arrested him, they were just beginning to realize their nightmare had only just begun. The police station was silent. The kind of silence that felt heavy, thick with tension. The kind of silence that meant someone had just realized they made the biggest mistake of their life. The officers who had mocked and arrested the bus driver only an hour ago now stood frozen in place, their faces pale, their hands fidgeting at their sides. The truth had finally come out. He was not just a bus driver. He was connected, and not just to any ordinary people. The man who had walked into the station demanding his release was not just some lawyer. He was a powerful figure, someone who made things happen behind the scenes. The officers exchanged nervous glances, their minds racing. How had this gone so wrong? The chief loses control. The chief of police sat stiffly behind his desk, his hands clasped together, his jaw tight. He had run this station for years, had ruled over it however he pleased. But right now, he had never felt so small. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to sound composed. "Listen, I think there is a misunderstanding here." The lawyer sitting across from him did not blink. "Oh, there is no misunderstanding." He pulled a thick file from his briefcase and placed it on the chief's desk. The folder was filled with papers, reports, and legal documents. Evidence of everything that had just happened. "You arrested a man on false charges. You humiliated him in front of witnesses. You used your power to try and break someone who did nothing wrong. The lawyer's voice was calm, precise, deadly. And now you are going to pay for it. The chief shifted in his seat, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. Come on, he scoffed, trying to regain control. It is not like we beat the guy. It was just a misunderstanding. The lawyer slowly tilted his head. A misunderstanding? He gestured toward the hallway. You put an innocent man in a jail cell. The chief let out a dry chuckle. He was resisting. The lawyer slid a printed screenshot across the desk. It was a still from the bus passenger's recording, now circulating online. The image showed the bus driver standing calmly with his hands raised. Not resisting, not fighting, just being arrested for no reason. The chief's smirk disappeared instantly. The lawyer leaned in slightly. That video has already been sent to civil rights attorneys, the mayor's office, and multiple news stations. Right now, reporters are outside this building. You do not have a lot of time to decide how you want this to end for yourself. The chief's hands clenched into fists. He had bullied people his whole career. He had threatened, manipulated, and gotten away with worse. But this was different. He knew when he had lost, and he had lost tonight. The officers faced their consequences. The door to the office burst open, and 2 federal agents stepped inside. Their suits were sharp, their expressions unreadable. Chief Huxley? One of them said, flashing a Department of Justice badge. The chief barely nodded. You and several of your officers are under federal investigation for civil rights violations and abuse of power, the agent continued. You will come with us now. The chief shot up from his chair. You cannot be serious. The agent simply pulled out a warrant and placed it on the desk. This is serious, he said. The chief turned to his officers, expecting them to do something. Anything. But they just stood there, frozen. They had followed his orders for years. Now they were watching him fall. The chief's chest tightened as the agent reached for a pair of handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. The same words his officers had casually spoken to the bus driver just hours ago. Now, those words were being used against him. The cold metal snapped around his wrists, and for the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to be powerless. The officers who had arrested the bus driver stood in line, their names being called one by one. Officer Daniels? The young cop who had mocked the driver swallowed hard as 2 men approached him. You are suspended pending investigation. His eyes widened. Wait, I was just following orders. And now you are facing the consequences, the official said simply. One by one, they were stripped of their badges. One by one, they realized their careers were over. Some begged, some tried to argue, but it was too late. The bus driver had walked into the station in handcuffs. Now he was walking out free, while the men who put him here were being taken away instead. Walking out a free man. The doors of the station swung open, and the bus driver stepped outside. The cool night air hit his face, but he did not stop walking. He did not even look back. He had spent his whole life following the rules, doing everything right, and yet today he had been treated like a criminal for no reason. But now, the world had seen the truth, and those responsible were paying the price. A reporter pushed forward, a microphone in hand. Sir, do you have anything to say? The driver paused. He turned to face the cameras. The flashing lights illuminated his calm but powerful expression. They thought I was nobody, he said simply. Then, with quiet confidence, he stepped into the waiting car. But as the vehicle pulled away, something caught his attention. A black SUV was parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, its engine running. And even though he could not see inside, he knew someone was watching him. The car rolled down the quiet city street, its tires humming softly against the pavement. The bus driver sat in the back, staring out the window. Streetlights flickered past, their glow casting long shadows across the road. He should have felt relieved. The people who had humiliated him, arrested him, and tried to break him had faced their consequences. The chief was in handcuffs. The officers responsible had been stripped of their badges. Justice had been served. And yet, something did not feel right. There was a weight in his chest, an unease he could not shake. He pulled out his old flip phone, the one he had used for years. No apps, no internet, just simple calls and messages. One new message. His eyes narrowed. No number, no sender. He clicked to open it. This was not about you. Someone wanted you out of the way. The bus driver stared at the screen, his heartbeat slowing, the world around him fading into silence. What did that mean? His fingers tightened around the phone. This had started with 2 officers harassing him, but what if it had never been about them? What if they were just pawns in a bigger game? He took a slow breath and looked up. His reflection in the car window stared back at him. But just beyond it, in the darkened streets, something else caught his eye. A black SUV. It had been following them for several blocks, keeping its distance. Tinted windows, no visible plates. His grip on the phone tightened. "Driver," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Take a right up ahead, then left, then another right." The driver did as instructed, making a series of turns through the city. The SUV followed every move. The bus driver's stomach hardened. This was no coincidence. He leaned forward slightly. "Pull into that gas station," he said. The driver nodded, easing the car into the lot of a small 24-hour gas station. The bus driver stepped out, stretching his arms, pretending to be casual. He glanced toward the SUV. It had slowed down but did not stop. Instead, it kept rolling past, disappearing into the night, watching, waiting. He did not know who they were, but he knew one thing. This was far from over. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a different phone. One he never used except in situations like this. A number was already programmed. He pressed call. The phone rang once, then twice. A deep voice answered. "It's me," the bus driver said, his voice calm. "We have a problem." Silence on the other end. Then a slow, measured response. "How bad?" The bus driver's gaze drifted toward the road where the SUV had disappeared. "I think it is just getting started." The line clicked off. The bus driver turned back toward the car, his face unreadable. He had spent his life staying in the background, doing his job, avoiding trouble. But someone had just made a mistake. They had come after him. And now he was going to find out why. The real fight had just begun.